Why did ancient scribes make changes to the Bible? Take the opening chapters of Genesis, where God creates the world in 7 days. Which day did God stop working? If you read the ESV, it says, "On the 7th day God finished his work and rested." But in the NRSV, it says, "On the 6th day God finished the work and rested on the 7th." This difference is called a textual variant. One ancient Hebrew source, called the Masoretic text, says God finished work on the 7th day, but some ancient scribes worried that this implied God worked on the 7th day, which was inappropriate. So it looks like a scribe changed it to the 6th day, and this is the version used by an ancient Greek translation called the Septuagint, and another Hebrew version written by the Samaritans. So when most people pick up an English translation of the Bible and start reading a book, they think they are reading a translation of a single ancient text, when in reality the translation is regularly supplemented with sources from different times and sometimes even different languages. Modern translators work from a reconstructed text, most often referred to as a critical edition, because the underlying ancient sources have differences. While the majority of these differences can be accounted for as mistakes in the copying process, there are many examples of deliberate changes made by ancient scribes. For example, there's 2 different versions of the Book of Jeremiah, and 3 very different versions of the Book of Esther. When ancient sources for the Bible disagree, the process of figuring out which version is the most original is called textual criticism. In this 3-part series, we're going to look at the Hebrew Bible, or Old Testament, and explore the reasons why ancient scribes made changes to the text, and how scholars evaluate these changes and decide which version is the original wording. Let's start with our ancient sources of the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible is a collection of writings written and compiled over a span of around 1,000 years in the first millennium BCE. We don't have any of the originals, so we rely on various ancient copies and translations. Apart from a few sections in Aramaic, the Hebrew Bible was mostly written in, well, Hebrew. But our earliest complete copies of the Hebrew text only date to around 1000 CE. That's over 1,000 years after the last texts of the Hebrew Bible were written. This medieval source is called the Masoretic text. The name Masoretic text actually refers to a group of closely related manuscripts created by scribes called the Masoretes. Because Hebrew originally had no vowels, the same consonants could be read in different ways. For example, in English, imagine I had the following consonants: G, D, S, N, W, H, R, and you had to infer the vowels. You could write God is nowhere, or you could write God is now here. These have very different meanings, and the same thing can happen in ancient Hebrew. For example, Genesis 49:10 in the NRSV reads, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah until tribute comes to him," whereas the King James Version reads, "until Shiloh come." Shiloh was an ancient city that represented destruction. These very different readings come from interpreting the same consonants in Hebrew with different vowels. Beginning in the Middle Ages, a group called the Masoretes used a system of vowels and accent markers to create a standardized version of the Hebrew text. However, even with this system, there are still some differences between the various copies of the Masoretic text. The Masoretic text is the primary source for modern translations of the Hebrew Bible. It's the starting point in our translation patchwork, but it's not the oldest ancient source we have. The oldest complete source for the Hebrew Bible is a collection of Greek translations called the Septuagint, or LXX, meaning 70. Most of the translations took place between the 3rd and 1st century BCE, but revisions continued to be made until around the 2nd century CE. Our earliest complete copies of the Septuagint date to the 4th and 5th centuries, over 500 years earlier than our copies of the Masoretic text. The Septuagint is a really important source because even though the translations were written in Greek, they were translated from a Hebrew text that was older than the Masoretic text. So sometimes the Septuagint preserves an older reading than the Masoretic text. Another really important source is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves at Qumran by the Dead Sea between 1946 and 1956. Most of the scrolls are fragmentary, with nearly complete copies of Psalms, Isaiah, and Leviticus. The scrolls contain sections from every book of the Hebrew Bible except Esther. What is more, the scrolls date to between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, making them, for the most part, the oldest copies of the Hebrew text that we have. The last major source is the Samaritan Pentateuch. The Samaritans are a Jewish sect who trace their origins to the north of Israel, Samaria. They only considered the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible canonical, the Pentateuch. We have copies of their translation of the Pentateuch. One complete copy dates to around 1100 CE. Interestingly, some of the Dead Sea Scrolls preserve readings that are closer to the Samaritan version, indicating that they may predate the Masoretic text. There are also some additional sources, such as translations of the Hebrew text into Aramaic called Targums. There's also the Peshitta, a Syriac translation dating to the 2nd century CE. This was mostly used by early converts to Christianity. And finally, Latin translations, the most significant being the Vulgate, translated by Jerome somewhere around 400 CE. All of the ancient sources we have looked at have differences in certain places. Most are scribal mistakes in the copying process, but scribes did make deliberate changes, such as trying to clarify something unclear, fixing something they didn't agree with, or even on occasion changing the theology of a text to better suit their community. The goal of textual criticism is to evaluate the differences that occur during the transmission process and try to work out what the original or earliest reading is. But this isn't possible in every case. For example, the Septuagint version of Jeremiah is around 3,000 words shorter than the Masoretic text. Its structure is reordered, and it also contains material not found in the Masoretic version. This is more than just a translation issue. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve readings from both versions, and we now know that there were multiple versions of Jeremiah that existed in ancient times. Different communities used different versions. It's no longer possible to find the earliest reading from before the text split off into multiple editions, and this isn't just unique to Jeremiah. So how does a scholar evaluate differences? Now, you might think scholars would just take the oldest manuscripts, so preference the Dead Sea Scrolls when we have them, then the Septuagint, and then the Masoretic text. But this isn't how it works, because scribes had different goals, and sometimes it's clear that the scribes of the Dead Sea Scrolls and Septuagint introduced changes, and other times it's obvious that the Masoretic scribes introduced changes. So some scholars have come up with general principles. The first being that the more difficult reading is preferred. The principle is, if a scribe is presented with a difficult reading, they are more likely to simplify or harmonize it than to take an easy reading and make it more difficult. Our example from the beginning of this video illustrates this. In Genesis 2:2, God finishing work on the 7th day in the Masoretic text is more theologically difficult than the 6th day found in the Septuagint. So scholars generally think the 7th day is more original. Another principle is that the shorter reading is preferred. The general tendency of ancient scribes was to expand or to add commentary rather than to omit information. For example, the Masoretic text of 1 Samuel chapter 2 verse 22 reads, "And Eli was very old." The Dead Sea Scrolls read, "And Eli was very old, 90 years, adding the exact age. This scroll, 4Q Samuel A, contains multiple examples of these extra details, so they are generally considered expansions. Another scholar has proposed this principle: which reading best explains how the other readings would arise? And this seems sound, but there are times when there are multiple good explanations. In fact, all of these principles are not hard and fast rules. Do you remember that old spelling principle? I before E except after C? Well, protein, C's, and weird beg to differ. There are many cases where the principles don't work. Ultimately, every set of differences has to be evaluated on its own merits, and an argument is formulated to select the earliest reading. The world's leading expert on textual criticism says the most important factor is common sense. That is the job of textual critics, to evaluate all the evidence available in the context of the passage and make a case for why one reading should be preserved over another. This usually begins with evaluating all the possible reasons a scribe would have to make a change. So why did ancient scribes make changes? There's a lot of reasons: accidental and intentional changes. Accidental changes are things like mistaken letters, or skipped lines, or accidental repetition. But there are also many variants which scholars consider to be intentional. A scribe might make theological changes. These are where scribes believed the text was in error, or portrayed God in a bad light, and they needed to fix it. An example is Exodus 24:10. The Masoretic text reads, "And they saw the God of Israel," referring to Moses and the elders of Israel seeing God. However, the Septuagint and some Targums read, "And they saw the place where the God of Israel stood." The translators of the Septuagint avoid the language of people seeing God directly, which was a theological problem in Jewish thought. Sometimes scribes would remove offensive language. For example, some scribes would frequently remove the word Baal, which means owner or lord, but it's also the name of a deity that was seen by some as a rival to Yahweh. Scribes would replace the word with Bosheth, which means shame. So in 2 Samuel 4:4, the Masoretic text reads, "And his name was Mephibosheth." But the Greek Septuagint probably preserves the more original, and his name was Memphibaal. There are also times when scribes add additional explanations. This is where a scribe will add little notes to make something clearer. For example, in Genesis 7:6, the Masoretic text reads, "And the flood was water upon the earth." The Septuagint doesn't have "was water." It looks like the Hebrew word for flood might not have been widely understood, so the scribe added a little explanation. Scribes could also update archaic language, very similar to how we might update Old English. If you saw the word betwixt, you probably have no idea what it means, so I would use between instead. Some ancient scribes felt free to do the same thing. These are just a few examples of the types of changes scribes could make. And so most modern English translations of the Hebrew Bible will use the Masoretic text as a base, but they are supplemented with other sources, maybe a word from the Septuagint here, a phrase from the Dead Sea Scrolls there. While many are just small changes that don't substantially alter the meaning of the text, there are some significant changes that ancient scribes made. So in the next 2 episodes, I'm going to look at the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls and show you some of the most significant differences between these sources and the Masoretic text. You'll come away with a much better understanding of how and why ancient scribes changed the text. This 3-part series was made possible by the American Academy of Religion and the Henry Luce Foundation. My name is Lachlan, and you've been watching Tablets and Temples.